They said the doors never opened after sundown, that no lantern was lit within its walls once night fell, and yet travelers on the coastal roads swore they heard voices chanting, weeping, or screaming, long after the bells had rung for silence. Those who went to the Ashford convent seeking mercy never returned unchanged. The records you are about to hear were sealed for nearly a century, hidden away in dust and silence. What they reveal should never have survived. Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. The Ashford family first arrived in the Maine wilderness in the late 18th century, settling along the ragged coastline where the forests pressed close against the sea. They built their holdings with quiet determination, presenting themselves as pious, charitable Anglicans. To the surrounding villages they were benefactors, establishing a convent, sponsoring a small infirmary, and offering care to the afflicted poor who otherwise had no hope of treatment. The convent they raised in 1798 was known officially as Sancta Misericordia. Its whitewashed walls stood stark against the dark pines, its spire visible even from the rocky inlets where fishermen worked. To ordinary eyes it was a place of devotion, a sanctuary for troubled women, and a rare comfort in a harsh land. To the Ashfords themselves it was something else entirely. The family's name was whispered with reverence in the neighboring town. It was said no one who crossed their threshold was ever turned away. Young women struggling with what was called female weakness or melancholia were taken in. Widows who could not remarry were sheltered. Daughters whose behavior disgraced their families were discreetly hidden away. The Ashfords promised rehabilitation, moral restoration, and a return to health. The results, they claimed, spoke for themselves. For nearly 20 years, families sent their afflicted women to Sancta Misericordia. Many were returned seemingly cured. Others never came back at all, their absence explained as a choice to devote themselves fully to religious life. Few questioned these accounts. The Ashfords were respected, educated, and wealthy. Their authority was rarely challenged. But in 1834, troubling whispers began to seep out of the convent walls. The first written note of suspicion appears in a parish record from Millbridge, dated March 7 of that year. Reverend Caleb Hensley recorded that two fishermen traveling by cart past the convent at dusk reported seeing pale figures at the upper windows, their faces contorted as if in pain, though no sound issued from them. Hensley dismissed the account as superstition, yet he added with hesitation, "Their description troubled me. They spoke of the figures as though they were not nuns but women bound, their heads shaved." Later that same spring, a merchant's wife from Castine, Eleanor Burnham, returned from the convent after nearly 2 years' absence. Her husband had sent her away for what he termed hysteria. When she stepped back into society, she was almost unrecognizable. Her speech was halting, her memory fragmented. She bore strange scars along her temples and behind her ears. When asked, she could not explain how they were made. Others followed. By midsummer, 3 more women had been released under similar conditions, silent, scarred, and broken. At first, the townspeople excused these changes as consequences of illness, but a pattern was emerging. Those who returned from the Ashford convent were not merely cured or tamed, they were profoundly altered. Some no longer recognized their own children, others wept without cease. One attempted to tear her own hair out in the middle of Sunday service, whispering, cut it away," until her husband carried her screaming from the pew. By autumn, rumors spread of locked rooms, midnight experiments, and unnatural cries echoing across the grounds when storms rattled the coast. A mill worker claimed he had delivered a shipment of coal to the convent's furnace, and been ordered to leave it outside the iron gate. From within he swore he heard the sounds of saws and hammers, though no repairs were being made to the convent structure itself. The villagers began to question what the Ashford family truly practiced behind their wall. At the center of it all was the family matriarch, Mother Superior Helena Ashford. Described as a woman of stern beauty and unyielding composure, Helena maintained a facade of devoutness. She spoke eloquently at parish gatherings and donated generously to church causes. Her 2 younger sisters, Sister Miriam Ashford and novice Clara Ashford, were quieter but equally enigmatic. Miriam in particular was said to possess an unusual knowledge of anatomy for a woman of her station, often assisting local physicians when accidents at sea left men gravely wounded. The Ashfords' influence grew stronger as suspicions mounted. Many families continued to send their daughters to Sancta Misericordia, unwilling to believe ill of those who had become so powerful in both church and town. For every troubling tale, There was another woman who returned seemingly well, her manners corrected, her melancholy lifted. These successes were paraded in Sunday services as proof of the convent's holiness, yet behind closed doors a shadow had settled. In December of 1834, a woman named Mary Dyer, daughter of a shipwright from Bangor, vanished within the convent walls. Her father demanded answers, but was told Mary had chosen to remain in religious service. He refused to accept this explanation. For weeks he pressed the issue, traveling between parishes, petitioning officials, gathering signatures, but just as his complaints began to reach sympathetic ears, Dyer was found dead, washed ashore on the Penobscot River, his throat cut from ear to ear. The death was ruled a robbery. The community, shaken, fell silent. It was the beginning of the end, for beneath the respectable veneer of the Ashford convent lay a truth darker than the surrounding forest. The whispers of sores and screams were not superstition. The scars were not accidents of illness. What Helena Ashford and her sisters pursued inside Sancta Misericordia was not prayer, nor penance, nor charity. It was something else entirely, something clinical, methodical, and monstrous. The details that follow are not conjecture. They are drawn from court records, parish notes, surviving medical correspondence, and the testimony of the few who escaped the Ashford grasp. The deeper one reads, the clearer it becomes. The Ashford family was less a convent than a clandestine laboratory. Their pursuit was not salvation of souls, but dissection of minds. The first true evidence against the Ashford convent did not come from official channels, but from the bodies of the women themselves. Their return to their families was supposed to be a blessing, a proof of the convent's healing power. Instead, it became the most damning testimony against it. In early 1835, a woman named Abigail Morton was released after a year-long stay. Her father, a farmer in Blue Hill, described his shock in a letter preserved in the county archives. When Abigail stepped through our door, she did not look at me nor at her mother. She fixed her eyes on the far wall, and her lips twitched without sound. She bore 2 lines on her temples, thin but cruel, as though a heated wire had been drawn against her skin. When I asked her how she fared, she only shook her head once, and tears came but no words. Similar accounts followed. By summer, 3 more women, Hannah Lowell, Rebecca Dean, and Elizabeth Carr, had been returned in comparable condition. All were diminished, all carried peculiar marks near the head or scalp, and all had lost much of their memory, as if some part of their very selves had been erased. Neighbors began whispering of Ashford scars, though none dared say it publicly. These marks became a grim signature of the convent's work. The rise of Dr. Silas Harrow. It was around this time that the Ashfords' name began appearing in the correspondence of physicians. One man in particular, Dr. Silas Harrow of Portland, grew close to the family. Trained in Edinburgh but of middling reputation, Harrow had struggled to establish himself. The Ashfords gave him purpose, and in turn he gave them legitimacy. Harrow's letters, later seized during the Millbridge inquiry, describe his fascination with what he termed the Ashford method. In a note to a colleague dated May 1835, he wrote, "The sisters Ashford have discovered a manner of correction I have not elsewhere seen. They speak of excision, not upon the flesh, but upon the very seat of thought. Their patients emerge subdued, their mania quenched. If scars must remain, they are a small price for the restoration of order." To Harrow, the broken women released into society were not evidence of cruelty, but proof of progress. He defended the convent, arguing that their works surpassed the crude bleedings and purges then common in medicine. His growing reputation lent weight to the Ashfords' enterprise. By winter, physicians as far as Boston were referring troubled women to the convent. The Ashfords were becoming more than local figures. They were building an institution. Whispers behind closed doors. Families meanwhile suffered in silence. In one preserved testimony, the brother of Rebecca Dean confided to his pastor that his sister had returned a stranger. She would sit for hours rocking, whispering under her breath the same phrase again and again, "Cut it away, cut it away." When he confronted the Ashfords, Sister Miriam assured him this was a natural stage of recovery. "The mind resists its own correction," she said calmly, "but in time the wounds of thought will heal as surely as the wounds of flesh." The brother accepted this at first. He had little choice, but the phrase haunted him until his own death years later. The spread of their influence. By late 1835, the Ashford convent had become a magnet for desperate families. The reputation of miraculous cures outweighed the murmurs of failure. For every broken woman returned, another stood in church as evidence of recovery. A wife once raving with visions now docile, a daughter once defiant now obedient. These examples convinced the public far more than the whispered scars did. Parish records show a steady increase in admission. In 1836 alone, at least 20 women were committed to Sancta Misericordia by their families. Some were named as hysterics, others had been accused of melancholy, excessive pride, or uncontrollable grief. A few had simply proven unwilling to marry the men chosen for them. The convent accepted them all, and yet few outside noticed the pattern. Of those admitted, only half ever returned. The rest vanished into the silence of the cloisters, explained away as vocations to lifelong service. A note of doubt: it is here that the first seeds of resistance appeared. In September 1836, a woman named Margaret Tilson fled the convent under cover of night. She was found days later wandering the woods near Ellsworth, barefoot and delirious. When questioned, she insisted she had been kept in a locked chamber, subjected to machines that hummed and knives that burned. Her head was shaven unevenly, and behind her ear was a raw wound poorly sutured. Tilson did not live long enough to give a full account. She succumbed to fever within weeks, but her final ravings, recorded by a local minister, carried a chilling consistency. They open the head, they take the thought, they bind it with their prayers. The prayers are knives, the prayers are knives. Her death should have raised alarm. Instead, it was dismissed as hysteria, the very condition that had consigned her to the convent. The Ashford's influence ensured that skepticism never took root, building a reputation. By 1837, the Ashfords were being quietly praised in certain medical circles. Harrow began presenting observations in private gatherings, hinting at methods too controversial to be published. He spoke of incisions that calmed mania, of lesions that dulled grief. Some dismissed him as a charlatan, others listened keenly. A physician from Boston, Dr. Nathaniel Morse, recorded in his diary after attending one such meeting: Harrow speaks with fire, though he dares not say all. He hints of a convent in Maine where the veil of madness is lifted by blade and fire. I cannot decide whether to shudder or to marvel. Yet if his words hold truth, they point to a new frontier of science. Thus the Ashford work began to seep, drop by drop, into the bloodstream of medicine. The convent's walls concealed their practice, but their ideas were beginning to circulate beyond. The silence of the families. For the families of the afflicted, the silence was enforced not by law but by shame. To admit that one's daughter had been cut and broken was to admit complicity in sending her there. Many preferred secrecy to scandal. The social codes of the time demanded obedience, chastity and quietude in women. Any who strayed could be punished not only by society but by their own kin. The convent offered an answer, and families embraced it, even when it destroyed the very women it claimed to heal. Thus the Ashfords were protected by a shield of silence. The suffering they inflicted became invisible, hidden in parlors and behind shutters, whispered of but never proclaimed. A growing shadow. By the close of the decade, the convent stood at the height of its power. Dozens of women had been processed through its halls. Their broken bodies and haunted eyes marked the cost, but few dared to speak. What began as whispers in the woods had become a network of influence, stretching from Maine to Massachusetts, from quiet villages to respected universities. The Ashfords had built a system of intake, of procedure, of silence, but the first cracks were beginning to show, and soon the entire edifice would tremble. By the year 1838, the Ashford convent had reached a peculiar balance between reverence and dread. From the outside it appeared serene, whitewashed stone walls, orderly gardens, and the distant toll of bells marking the hours of prayer. But those who passed near its grounds often remarked upon another sound, faint, metallic and strangely rhythmic. At times it was described as hammering, at others as the low grinding of a wheel. Always it came from beneath the earth, from the sealed chambers where no visitor was allowed. The sisters explained these noises as maintenance of the convent's heating system. Few questioned this excuse. After all, who wished to believe otherwise? And yet in certain homes, when daughters returned from the convent altered and scarred, whispers of hidden machinery took on a more sinister edge. The cellars below, the convent's subterranean rooms, were never included in its official description. Builders were paid in coin and silence, their contracts destroyed after the work was complete, but fragments of their testimony, collected years later during the Millbridge inquiry, paint a chilling picture. The Ashfords had ordered chambers carved into the granite bedrock, accessible only through narrow stairways. The air there was heavy, stale, and unlit except by lanterns. Within these caverns, workbenches and storage vaults were installed. Most ominously, a large central room contained iron brackets fixed to the stone floor.
their purpose concealed by a cloak of pious secrecy. One Mason, long after fleeing Maine, confessed, "They told us it was for storing wine, but what sort of wine is kept in a room with chains in the what wine requires drains carved into the floor?"
Sister Miriam's instruments. The architect of these subterranean horrors was Sister Miriam Ashford, the middle sibling. Unlike Agatha, who cloaked their work in scripture, or Temperance, who devised methods of conditioning, Miriam devoted herself to instruments. Her surviving notebooks preserved in the Milbridge archives contain sketches that blur the line between surgical tool and torture device. There are delicate trephines designed to bore precise circles into the skull. There are slender probes labeled with chilling notes. Produces calm if inserted 3/8" behind the temple. There are clamps meant to immobilize the head while incisions were made. The pages are stained with ink, rust, and in places, something darker. Miriam referred to these tools as keys to the soul. She wrote with icy confidence, "The mind is a labyrinth, but the skull provides its entrances. With sufficient patience, one may discover the doors and with the proper key, open or close them at will." The case of Sarah Kimball. It was in this period that the case of Sarah Kimball emerged, one of the few detailed accounts to survive from a patient's perspective. A farmer's daughter from Bangor, Sarah was admitted in late 1838, after what her family described as fits of melancholy and obstinance. Unlike others, Sarah left behind a diary smuggled to her cousin after her release. Though much of it is fragmented, it offers a rare window into life inside the convent. Her earliest entries describe long hours of prayer, silence at meals, and constant surveillance. But as weeks passed, the entries grow darker. "They have taken us underground. The air smells of oil and iron. I was told it is for purification, but why does purification require straps? Today Sister Miriam placed a cap upon my head with wires like claws. She whispered that my sins would be drawn out. I felt heat and then emptiness. When I woke, I could not recall my mother's face. We are told to sing hymns, though I can scarcely form words. The others do not sing at all. Their mouths open but no sound comes, only staring." Sarah was released after 6 months. Her family accepted her altered demeanor as proof of healing. But her hidden diary told another story, one that was not discovered until decades later. The reputation of miracles. For the wider public, however, the convent's reputation continued to rise. Clergymen praised it as a place where disobedient daughters were reshaped into proper wives and mothers. Physicians marveled at its supposed ability to cure hysteria, melancholia, and even grief. By 1839, the Ashfords were receiving patients from as far as New York and Pennsylvania. Wealthy families were willing to pay extraordinary sums for treatment. The sisters' coffers swelled, enabling further expansion of their hidden laboratories, yet every miracle had its shadow. For every smiling young woman presented in church as cured, another lingered in her family home blank-eyed, unable to recognize her own kin. Some never spoke again. Others developed violent tremors or headaches that left them bedridden. But shame silenced the family. To admit that their daughters had been destroyed was to admit their own role in sending them there. The erosion of memory. One of the most disturbing patterns of this era was the erasure of memory. Time and again families reported that their daughters returned unable to recall entire chapters of their lives. Favorite songs, childhood friends, even the names of siblings were lost. In 1839, Eleanor Briggs was released to her husband after 6 months at the convent. Once a sharp-tongued woman, she now spoke softly, smiled constantly, and seemed incapable of anger. But when asked about her infant son, she only blinked in confusion. Her husband insisted that this was proof of healing. "She is at peace," he told neighbors. But Eleanor's mother wrote privately in her Bible, "My daughter lives, but the Lord has taken her mind. She sits with her babe upon her lap, yet looks upon him as if upon a stranger. They say, she is cured, but I say she has been erased." The influence of science. It was during this same period that Dr. Silas Harrow became fully entangled with the Ashfords. His letters grew increasingly fevered, blending admiration with unease. One entry, written in late 1839, captures his torment. "They achieve with scalpel what sermons cannot. They burn away the roots of sin, as a gardener burns weeds. And yet, When I look upon the husks of their patience, I ask myself, are these women healed, or have they been hollowed? Harrow began drinking heavily, unable to reconcile his awe with his conscience, yet he never broke ties with the Ashfords. Instead, he defended them publicly, claiming their work heralded a new age of medical understanding. Through Harrow, their findings seeped into the medical community. Physicians in Boston and beyond began experimenting cautiously with cranial interventions, unaware, or unwilling to admit, the horrific cost. A growing unease. Despite the growing acclaim, unease stirred among the local populace. Farmers who delivered produce to the convent noticed crates of unusual contents being carried in glass jars, polished instruments, powders with foreign labels. Postal workers whispered of packages sent abroad, wrapped too carefully to be mere let. One driver, tasked with transporting supplies, described seeing through a partially open crate. Inside was not food, nor books, but a head. A woman's head, preserved in some clear liquid. I said nothing, for I feared to lose my life. Whether this testimony was truth or exaggeration, it spread through taverns and kitchens, feeding rumors of something unspeakable beneath the convent's pious veneer, the shield of silence. Yet the Ashfords remained untouchable. Their piety, their charitable works, and the shame of their victims' families combined to form a shield stronger than any law. No one dared accuse them openly, and those who whispered too loudly found themselves ostracized, as though the community itself preferred not to know. In this silence the sisters thrived. By 1840, their convent had processed nearly 100 women. Of these, half returned diminished, a quarter disappeared into lifelong service, and the remainder, perhaps 20 or more, were never seen again. The Ashfords recorded every case in meticulous detail, preserving data, diagrams and specimens in their underground vaults. To them, each woman was not a person but an experiment, another entry in their unfolding science toward a dark horizon. Thus, as the 1840s dawned, the Ashfords stood at the height of their power. They had wealth, reputation and secrecy. Their instruments grew sharper, their methods more precise, and though whispers of horror circulated in parlors and kitchens, no one dared bring them into the light. But every empire of silence contains its own ruin, and before long, cracks would widen into chasms. By the early months of 1841, the Ashford convent no longer resembled a sanctuary. To outsiders, its bells still tolled and its walls gleamed white against the main forests. But within, the air was saturated with oil smoke and the metallic tang of blood. The sisters, once admired for their devotion, had become figures of dread, even to those who served them. The numbers of patients swelled, as did the number of those who vanished. Families still delivered their daughters willingly, but they did so with unease, as if handing lambs to wolves and pretending it was salvation. Some whispered of voices echoing at night, low moans that seemed to seep through stone. Others swore the convent's windows never opened, no matter the season, as though to keep something in. And always there was the smoke, drifting from chimneys at odd hours, too thick and acrid to be wood alone. The fire of May 1841. It was on the night of May 16, 1841, that smoke became more than a rumor. A fire broke out within the convent's lower chamber. By dawn, the building still stood, but its interior bore scars of flame and water. Several townsmen claimed they had rushed to aid, only to be refused entry by the sisters, who barred the gates until the blaze was subdued. What burned in those hours remains uncertain. No lives were officially lost, yet after the fire, several patients were never seen again. When asked, the Ashfords stated calmly that the women had been transferred to other institutions. No records of such transfers exist. Later, one parishioner recorded in his journal, "I saw with my own eyes what they carried out beneath tarps that morning. The shapes were not of furniture, but of bodies, and the smell upon the air was not wood but flesh." A brief decline. The fire marked the beginning of a decline. Families grew hesitant, enrollment slowed, and for the first time the Ashfords faced questions they could not easily silence. Whispers spread from Millbridge to Boston that the convent was no holy refuge, but a house of cruel experiment. Sister Agatha responded with sermons, delivered in a trembling but resolute voice, declaring the fire the work of Satan himself. Jealous of their divine mission, parishioners wept and repented,
Yet doubts lingered. Sister Temperance withdrew deeper into her methods of conditioning, insisting upon harsher regimens of fasting, silence and sensory deprivation for her charges. Sister Miriam meanwhile became more reclusive, descending for days into the subterranean vaults, emerging pale and trembling, her notebooks filled with increasingly erratic sketches. The daughter's testimonies. It was in this period that testimonies began to circulate in secret, often among servants or relatives. Two are preserved in the archives of the Millbridge Historical Society. The first, from a young woman named Clara Densmore, describes her weeks underground. They bound me upon a chair of iron, my head held fast with screws. Sister Miriam pressed a device upon my brow and turned a crank until sparks filled my eyes. They told me my sins were leaving me. When I screamed, they placed cloth in my mouth and continued until I knew nothing but pain. When I woke, I could not remember my brother's name. The second, from an anonymous testimony written in shaky hand. Records. At night we were kept in stone cells, no larger than coffin. Water dripped from the ceiling. When one girl begged for mercy, they carried her away. I never saw her again. Yet in the mornings, the sisters would smile as if nothing had passed, and told us to give thanks for our healing. Such accounts, though few, spread like embers in dry grass, feeding suspicion. The departure of Dr. Harrow, Dr. Silas Harrow, who had long defended the sisters, began at last to falter. His letters from this time reveal a man undone by guilt. In one, dated August 1841, he writes, "I can no longer deny what I have seen. These are not treatments but desecrations. They hollow the body in search of God, but God is not found, only vacancy. I have profited from their work, but my conscience rots with." Shortly after, Harrow left Millbridge, abandoning his practice. He traveled south and died in obscurity, though his notes, recovered decades later, provided vital evidence against the Ashfords. Resistance within. Among the patients, resistance simmered. A young woman named Hannah Bickford is said to have stolen keys from a distracted novice. With them, she opened several cell doors one October night, leading a handful of women into the wood. Some perished from exposure, others were recaptured, but a few reached neighboring towns and told their stories. It was Hannah's testimony that first reached Boston newspapers, albeit in veiled form. One article, printed in November 1841, referred to a convent in Maine, where cruel experiments masquerade as cures. Though names were not mentioned, many readers guessed the truth. The raid of 1842. At last, in January 1842, authorities arrived to investigate. By then, the convent stood in eerie silence. No bells tolled, no voices sang. The sisters themselves were gone, vanished without trace. Inside, investigators found signs of abandonment: scattered clothing, overturned benches, extinguished lanterns. But in the underground vaults, they found more than silence. Jars containing preserved organs lined the shelves. Instruments lay rusted, but unmistakable. Chains were still bolted to the stone floor. In one chamber, shallow graves yielded bone. Some belonged to women in their 20s, others disturbingly small, as of infants. The official report described it as evidence of irregular burial practices, but privately several investigators confessed their horror. One wrote in his diary, "What we uncovered was not holy ground, but a slaughterhouse, and yet the women who wrought this terror had fled like smoke, leaving us only their shadows." Legacy of ashes. The convent was condemned, its walls left to crumble. Locals avoided the site, claiming the soil itself was cursed. Travelers reported hearing cries at night when passing near the ruins, though none dared linger. The Ashford sisters were never found. Some claimed they fled overseas, others that they perished in the woods. Still others whispered they remained hidden, continuing their work in secret. What is certain is this: their methods did not die with them. Fragments of their notebooks circulated in medical circles, influencing treatments for hysteria and melancholia well into the late. Behind polished lectures and clinical jargon, the echo of the Ashfords' cruelty endured. The unhealed wound. For the families of Millbridge, the wound never closed. Generations later, stories of daughters lost to the convent persisted, spoken in hushed tones at kitchen tables. Some claimed that descendants of the cured bore marks, odd scars at the temples, sudden lapses of memory, an uncanny stillness in their demeanor. Whether truth or superstition, The Ashford's shadow lingered long after their walls fell, and to this day, in certain archives, there remain files locked and labeled simply, Ashford, restricted. Thus ended the convent's reign, not with confession or justice, but with silence and disappearance. The mystery of the Ashfords was never solved, only buried in ashes. But ashes, as history reminds us, are easily stirred. The raid of 1842 might have ended most stories, consigning the Ashford convent to ruin and rumor. Yet in truth, the most unsettling chapter began only after the sisters' flight. For though the women themselves vanished, the records they left behind, the instruments, the jars, the notebooks scattered through damp vaults, proved more enduring than their walls. It is here, in the papers of investigators and in the private collections of physicians, that we glimpse the second life of the Ashford experiments. If the convent was a tomb, its fragments became the notebooks. Among the debris seized from the convent were 12 bound volumes, each filled in meticulous hand. 3 bore the name Agatha, 4 were inscribed Prudence, and 5 were marked only with a symbol resembling a cross turned sideways. Scholars now attribute the latter to Sister Temperance, though certainty is impossible. The notebooks detailed procedures with chilling precision, trepanations performed with hand drills, incisions into the frontal lobe followed by behavioral observation, experiments in sensory deprivation. Each case was numbered, with initials for the subject, their age, and a summary of presenting sin, ranging from melancholia to impertinent laughter. One passage reads, Subject 14, Procedure, bilateral excision behind orbital ridge, result patient subdued, speech limited, gaze vacant, duration of compliance, 11 days before expiration. Such entries filled hundreds of pages. Notes of failures alternated with sketches of cranial structures, some startlingly accurate for their time. The hand that wrote them was steady, unemotional, as though describing carpentry rather than the hollowing of a mind. The seizure of evidence. Officially, the state declared the notebooks to be of no value save as evidence of crime, yet behind closed doors they circulated. A portion was locked in the Millbridge courthouse, another in Boston, while select pages made their way into private hands. Dr. Alcott, a physician from New York, admitted in his memoirs that he studied the Ashford records in the 1840s to refine his own theories of neurorestraint. Others drew diagrams nearly identical to those preserved at the convent. By 1850, several medical journals contained descriptions of surgical approaches uncannily similar to Ashford techniques, though published under more reputable names. Thus what should have been consigned to flames instead seeped quietly into the arteries of medical science. The Ashford cadavers. Equally troubling were the bodies uncovered during the raid. Reports differ on the number, though most sources place it at over 200. Some were skeletons, stacked neatly as though awaiting cataloging. Others were half preserved in tinctures of spirits, skin waxy, features still discernible. Investigators noted surgical scars upon nearly every specimen, incisions to the skull, excisions of tissue, signs of cauterization. In some, the brain itself had been removed and replaced with cloth soaked in resin, suggesting attempts at long-term preservation. Several physicians present argued, disturbingly, that the collection represented an invaluable archive for the study of human pathology. More disturbing still, fragments of the cadavers were indeed transported, not to cemeteries, but to laboratories. At least 2 institutions in Boston and 1 in Philadelphia received specimens under discreet cover, later denying knowledge when confronted. The bodies of the convent thus became, unwillingly, part of American medical instruction, the testimony of survivors.
It was also in these years that the voices of the living began to surface. Women who had fled or been released bore the scars not only upon their bodies but their speech. One, a woman named Margaret Flint, testified before a county magistrate in 1843. They told me my fits were demons. They cut me to let them out. After I could not walk without trembling. My father said I was cured, but I knew myself emptied. Another, Ellen Marrow, described the aftermath of conditioning. For months after leaving, I could not speak above a whisper. When I tried, pain like fire ran through my temples. I dreamed always of the chair, the straps, the smell of oil, the sound of turning screws. Though such testimonies were gathered, they were rarely published. Families suppressed them out of shame, fearing social ruin if it became known their daughters had been subject to such treatment. Silence remained the common cure, the hand of temperance. Among the recovered documents were fragments of Sister Temperance's methods of psychological conditioning. These reveal the peculiar cruelty of her approach: days of forced muteness, sudden bursts of light against blindfolded eyes, relentless repetition of prayers while food was withheld. One chilling line reads, "The body resists but the spirit learns. Repetition hollows the vessel until words enter without obstruction." This philosophy, stripped of its religious guise, bore striking resemblance to techniques later described in European asylums. The eerie continuity suggests that the Ashfords' practices were not as isolated as once believed, but part of a transatlantic undercurrent of experimentation upon the voiceless. The silence of records. By 1845, public discussion of the convent had nearly ceased. The official inquiry closed quietly, its findings sealed. Newspapers published only vague references to irregularities. The surviving women slipped into obscurity, often confined again by their families. And yet in medical circles whispers persisted. At Harvard, Yale, and the University of Pennsylvania, students dissected diagrams that bore no author's name, but matched the Ashford sketches line for line. Professors praised these as anonymous European contributions, avoiding mention of Maine. The sisters themselves remained phantoms. Reports surfaced of 3 women seen in Quebec, in Havana, in Lisbon. None were verified. The family curse. Locals meanwhile clung to superstition. The Ashford name, once spoken with deference, became an ill omen. Farmers claimed their cattle sickened when grazing near the ruin. Children told stories of pale women wandering the woods, whispering prayers in voices too low to belong to the living. A tale persisted that the Ashfords had made covenant not with God but with knowledge itself, and that knowledge demanded sacrifice. Each girl who entered their convent was an offering. The fire of 1841, they said, had not destroyed their work but baptized it in smoke. Such folklore, though dismissed by scholars, carried the weight of truth in the mouths of those who lived nearest the shadow. The weight of inheritance. What cannot be dismissed is this: the Ashfords changed not only their patients but their descendants. Families who had entrusted daughters to the convent often found themselves marked by shame, by whispered doubt, by unspoken suspicion that madness or defect would follow. Some indeed reported children prone to fits, others to peculiar silences, whether hereditary or imagined. Such signs haunted the bloodlines of Millbridge for generations. Even now, genealogists trace certain families back to the lost daughters, and speak of a pattern of nervous ailments that seems to persist. A return to ashes. By the end of the decade, the convent's ruins were deliberately set alight by townsfolk, reducing the walls to rubble. They hoped fire would cleanse what prayer could not, but fire cannot erase memory. Beneath the soil, the stone foundations remained, and beneath the stone, bones not carried away still slept. Travelers in later years claimed to hear strange echoes when stepping upon the ground, as though hollow chambers beneath still held breath. Thus Part 5 closes not with revelation but with an uneasy continuation. The sisters gone, their work dispersed, their name blackened, yet their influence woven into the very fabric of medical history. The anatomies they performed in silence outlived them, shaping practices that polite society credited to others. The Ashfords themselves became myth, but their methods, their terrible harvest of knowledge, endured. It is this endurance that haunts us most, for perhaps the greatest horror is not that the Ashfords vanished into obscurity, but that we continue unknowingly to carry their legacy. By the mid-1840s, the convent was nothing more than rubble blackened by fire, but the name Ashford lingered like a stain. In Millbridge, mothers hushed their children when passing the ruined grounds. In Boston, physicians whispered in lecture halls of anonymous studies, too precise to have emerged without careful human sacrifice. The sisters themselves had become specters, yet their work was alive, circulating where few dared name its origin. It is in this liminal period after their disappearance, but before memory hardened into folklore, that we find the most disturbing evidence of their influence: a hidden curriculum woven into medicine itself. The manuscripts in circulation. When investigators divided the convent's materials, their intentions were bureaucratic: Some volumes went to county records, some to Boston officials, and some disappeared into private collection. What they could not predict was how many pages would be copied, shared and repurposed under different names. By 1844, diagrams nearly identical to Miriam Ashford's sketches of cranial incisions appeared in a medical lecture delivered in Philadelphia. In 1846, a French periodical published a paper describing lobular excision for nervous agitation. The phrasing different, but the method unmistakably Ashford. None of these references mentioned the convent, nor the women who devised the procedure. Instead, they attributed the knowledge to continental studies, or to anonymous archival notes, yet the resemblance was too sharp to dismiss. Thus, while Millbridge's ruins smoldered in memory, the Ashford techniques lived on, polished and disguised, adopted into the bloodstream of modern medicine. The case of Dr. Elias Vane. One figure who illuminates this transmission is Dr. Elias Vane, a physician in New Haven. Records show that Vane corresponded directly with officials in Maine after the raid. By 1843 he possessed several Ashford notebooks, which he studied obsessively. In his unpublished journals, preserved by his descendants, Vane writes, "Though condemned, these women understood the brain as no man has dared. Their cruelty is evident, but their precision unmatched. If I separate the method from the madness, I may continue their work without their stain." But he could not. Within 3 years, rumors swirled that Vane was conducting private trials on patients admitted for melancholia. By 1848, his license was revoked, yet his notes reveal dozens of cases in which he attempted Ashford procedures under the guise of legitimate care. Vane is but one name. For every doctor who fell under scrutiny, others managed to incorporate fragments quietly, embedding Ashford influence deeper into the structure of practice. The doctrine of silence. Why did this transmission occur so easily? The answer lies in the culture of medicine itself. The Ashfords operated at a time when women, the poor, and the mentally unfit were regarded as lesser lives, available for experimentation. Physicians spoke of moral defects, as if they were anatomical growths to be cut away. Thus the Ashfords' cruelty did not appear alien, only excessive. Their methods could be reframed, softened, repackaged as progress, and since acknowledging their true origin would expose a scandal too vast, silence was chosen. Silence served both reputation and ambition. As one Boston professor wrote privately in 1851, better that the work be remembered as European than American, better that it be credited to men than to women, and better that it serve the living than honor the dead. This doctrine of silence is perhaps the most sinister of all, for it ensured that the victims remained nameless, their suffering converted into lessons, stripped of context. The family's dilemma. Meanwhile, the families of Millbridge and beyond endured their own torment. To speak openly of what had happened was to admit complicity, to confess they had delivered daughters into the sisters' hands. For many, silence was easier than truth. In 1847, a small circle of fathers met in Bangor, discussing whether to bring civil charges. The meeting collapsed in acrimony. One man tore up the minutes and declared the matter an unchristian stirring of ashes. No lawsuit ever materialized. Instead, grief festered privately. Letters preserved in family attics reveal mothers who never forgave themselves, fathers who forbade the Ashford name to be spoken in their homes. Generations later, descendants still whispered of the lost girls, but rarely in public. The silence of medicine was matched by the silence of families. Together these formed the perfect soil for the Ashfords' legacy to endure unchallenged. The European connection. One of the most troubling threads emerges in the late 1840s, when unconfirmed reports placed 3 women in Europe, specifically, in Lyon, in Seville, and in Prague. None of these sightings were corroborated, yet they coincided with sudden shifts in European asylum practices. French physicians began to emphasize moral surgery, a concept nearly identical to Prudence Ashford's notes on cranial modification. In Spain, asylum records describe conditioning regimens that echo temperance's methods, and in Prague, a single letter preserved in the university archives refers cryptically to the Sisters of Silence, who advised physicians private. It cannot be proved these were the Ashfords, but the timing invites suspicion. Their flight across the Atlantic would not have been impossible, especially with the wealth investigators later traced to foreign accounts.
If so, their disappearance was not the end of their work, but its expansion. The aftermath in Millbridge, back in Maine. The convent's ruins grew over with moss and weeds. Children dared each other to approach, swearing they heard sighs beneath the stones. Farmers avoided the land, claiming crops failed on its soil. By 1850, the site was abandoned entirely, yet no one proposed building upon it. It became a scar upon the landscape, not erased but avoided, and still from time to time, bones surfaced. In 1852, a heavy rain unearthed fragments of a skull. In 1856, a child found a rusted instrument, half buried in the earth. Each discovery reignited whispers, but never action. The community had chosen to bury the truth, and bury it they did. Again and again. The inheritance of knowledge. The greatest irony lies here. What the Ashfords perfected in secrecy became, by the second half of the century, mainstream. The rest cure for women, the experiments in cranial surgery, the conditioning of asylum patients, all bore the unmistakable fingerprint of their convent, though under respectable names. The very physicians who condemned the sisters in whispers benefited from their record. Textbooks carried forward their methods, with no mention of the blood that birthed them. Thus, when a surgeon in 1860 incised a patient's skull in search of relief, he was not innovating, but repeating a gesture, first performed in the shadows of Millbridge. The quietest horror, perhaps this is the true horror, of the Ashfords, not the screams within stone vaults, not the jars of organs or the chains, but the silence afterward, the way their cruelty dissolved into accepted practice, their names erased while their ideas endured. The convent fell, the sisters fled, but their shadow lengthened, reaching even into the bright lecture halls, where future doctors learned, and few realized that when they lifted the scalpel, they carried in their hand the weight of the Ashfords' legacy. By the 1850s, the name Ashford had become a whisper, its syllables smoothed into rumor. Yet even in their absence, fragments of their practices emerged with uncanny regularity in hospitals, lecture halls and asylums. What we now uncover is that these fragments did not circulate passively. They were cultivated, catalogued, and refined, as if guided by an unseen hand. The Vigilant Notes. In 1853, the Massachusetts Medical Society published a small monograph, attributed to an anonymous author. It described in dispassionate prose comparative trials upon the cranial vault. The diagrams within bore a signature unmistakably linked to Miriam Ashford, though here, they appeared redrawn, stripped of marginalia, cleansed of confession. Scholars later referred to these manuscripts as the Vigilant Note. Though unsigned, they spread quickly, reaching London and Berlin within 2 years. The anonymity shielded them from scrutiny. Few dared to ask where the knowledge originated. Fewer still cared. What mattered was that the methods worked. At least they appeared to. The notes introduced a generation of physicians to incisions along sutural lines, to manipulations of pressure that promised relief from seizures or madness. Each procedure bore the ghost of Millbridge, though cloaked in respectability. The Ashford archive in hiding. The question arises, who recopied these manuscripts? Investigators of later decades found troubling hints. A shipment traced to Providence contained volumes written in Temperance Ashford's unmistakable hand. Another, found in a private London collection, bore the initials P.A., burned faintly into the leather. If the sisters themselves had perished in Maine, how did their writings travel so far? The simplest explanation is also the most disturbing. They did not perish. Whether sheltered by sympathizers or dispersed into foreign convents, they remained at work, smuggling their knowledge outward. One account from 1857 describes a woman in a dark habit visiting a Parisian bookseller, offering manuscripts of anatomical curiosity. The shopkeeper's grandson swore the woman's accent was not French, but New England. The Ashford aesthetic. What makes their presence unmistakable is not only the content of the writings, but the aesthetic. The sisters had a peculiar style of notation, meticulous line work, paired with marginal corrections in faint, slanted script. They often used a symbol, 2 interlocking triangles, as a mark of completion. This mark appears inexplicably in medical atlases published decades later. It is as though the Ashford seal became part of medical shorthand, stripped of its origin, but retaining its shape. Thus, every student who sketched it in their notes, every surgeon who drew it upon a slate, was unknowingly inscribing the signature of Millbridge's exiled sister. The patient's silence. What of those subjected to these methods? Records are scarce, for patient testimony was rarely preserved, yet scattered reports from New Haven, Boston, and even Montreal hint at the after. A woman admitted for hysteria, who left with her speech halved, words slurred permanently. A sailor treated for seizures, whose head bore a fine line of scar tissue, whose fits never ceased. A young girl taken to an asylum for night terrors, later found sitting endlessly in corridors, rocking, incapable of naming her own parents. These are not isolated tragedies. They form a pattern, and though no official account linked them to Ashford practices, the resemblance is undeniable. The patients remained silent, whether by incapacity or by neglect. Silence compounded silence. Their lives, like those of the Millbridge children before them, were footnotes erased from the margins of medical advancement.
The European lecture. In 1859, a lecture was delivered in Vienna by Dr. Karl Henschel, who described a newly acquired American method for addressing frenzy of the nerves. His diagrams mirrored precisely those of Miriam Ashford. When asked the source of his knowledge, Henschel replied simply, "From papers of the Sisters of Silence." The audience laughed, assuming the phrase a metaphor. No one pressed further, but to us, this single remark is crucial. It confirms that by the late 1850s, the Ashfords were not merely remembered in whispers, they were being invoked, however obliquely, within the lecture halls of Europe. Their exile had not erased them, it had spread them. The anatomical cabinet. Most haunting of all is an object uncovered in 1861 within the cellar of a demolished asylum near Providence. Workers discovered a locked wooden cabinet containing 12 jars. Each jar held portions of human skull carefully labeled with initials and dates. Though the asylum director claimed ignorance, handwriting analyses identified the labels as belonging to Prudence Ashford. How the cabinet came to rest in Providence is unknown. Some speculate it was transported from Millbridge during the sisters' flight. Others argue it was created later, proof that at least one Ashford was active beyond Maine. Whatever its origin, the cabinet is proof of continuity. The work had not ended, it had migrated. The doctrine deepens. By the early 1860s, medicine had embraced certain Ashford practices so thoroughly that their origins could no longer be disentangled. Trepanation, rest cures, moral conditioning, all bore their mark, though none bore their name. Students memorized diagrams cleansed of horror. Doctors wielded instruments without knowing their pedigree, and the families of Millbridge continued to hold their tongues, unwilling to resurrect scandal. The doctrine of silence had become more than a strategy, it was a tradition. A letter from Millbridge. One last fragment must be noted. In 1862, a letter was written by a Millbridge widow to her cousin in Boston. In it, she confessed that she had seen a woman in dark garments walking near the ruins at dusk. The woman's gait, she wrote, was like Miriam's, though thinner, stooped. The widow ended the letter with a plea. If they yet live, they will never cease. Pray that they are not among us still. The cousin filed the letter among his family papers. It survived only by chance. The persistence of the Ashfords. Thus, in Part 7 we see that the Ashfords' shadow was not confined to Millbridge, nor to the 1830s and 40s. It extended into the very marrow of medicine, crossing oceans, infiltrating libraries, shaping practices that endured long after their convent burned. They were erased, yet ever present, condemned, yet imitated, dead perhaps, and yet alive in every diagram, every incision, every whispered phrase of the Sisters of Silence. The story no longer belongs only to Maine, it has become continental, perhaps even global, and yet at its core it remains the same. A family's pursuit of knowledge at the expense of humanity, a legacy embalmed in silence. The Ashfords' work continued not because it was defended, but because it was absorbed, and in that absorption, the line between progress and atrocity disappeared. By the mid-19th century, the Ashford name had almost vanished from public record. The convent had been burned, the official files sealed, and the families of victims scattered into private grief. Yet absence in the archives does not mean absence in truth. In many ways, it was the silence itself that guaranteed the sisters' survival, not their physical survival, perhaps, but their persistence as a shadow woven into medicine, education and culture. The weight of secrecy, silence did not fall naturally. It was cultivated. Families who had lost daughters weighed the unbearable shame of admitting what had happened. To confess meant acknowledging that their kin had been deceived, experimented upon, mutilated. In an era when family honor meant everything, silence became easier than truth. Doctors who had corresponded with the convent refused to speak. They burned letters, destroyed receipts, and adjusted their lecture notes, so that questionable procedures appeared untainted. Each act of concealment was justified as protection of careers, of reputations, of institutions. Even officials cooperated. When the federal inquiry concluded, most of the documentation was locked away, not destroyed. This suggests attention. The government recognized the material's scientific value, even while acknowledging its criminal origin. The preservation was pragmatic, the secrecy deliberate. Universities as vessels. Evidence of Ashford influence in academia grew strongest after 1865, when medical faculties in Philadelphia and New York began adopting what they called neurobehavioral conditioning therapy. Their descriptions matched almost word-for-word procedures recorded in Temperance Ashford's journals. Students memorized incisions and techniques without knowing the authorship. Professors cited continental experiments, never naming Milbridge. By the 1870s, fragments of Ashford theory were embedded in at least 4 major textbooks. It is tempting to assume that such embedding was accidental, yet marginal notes in university archives reveal deliberate choices. One Philadelphia instructor wrote, "The sources shall remain unstated. The merit of the work outweighs the stain of its origin." This phrase captures the moral compromise at the heart of the silence. Progress was worth the price, provided the price was buried. The Ashfords as myth. In local folklore, however, the sisters never vanished. Among coastal towns in Maine, children whispered of the black sisters who took girls from their beds. Some claimed to hear wailing from the burned convent grounds on storm nights. Others swore that women in long dark habits still walked the woods, offering cures in exchange for silence. Folklore serves as a distorted memory, carrying truths the official record tries to bury. When researchers later compared the stories, they found that details remained uncannily consistent across decades. The emphasis on surgical tools, the smell of ether, the promise of healing that led only to disappear. Thus, while institutions forgot, the people remembered, though in forms too strange to be taken seriously. A whispered network. Beyond folklore, subtler evidence suggests the Ashfords may have maintained a clandestine network of sympathizers. Letters discovered in 1872 in the estate of a Boston physician include references to the Ladies of Silence. These correspondences describe shipments of specimens, financial transfers to Montreal, and drafts of the comparative note. Whether these ladies were the Ashfords themselves or their imitators remains unclear. What is certain is that their knowledge circulated in coded language, cloaked in secrecy, and preserved by those who valued results over morality. The Parisian encounter. The strongest piece of testimony came in 1856, when a French physician claimed to have met Dr. Agatha Brennan, once Mother Superior Agatha Ashford, working under an assumed name in Paris. He described her as gray-haired, thin, but unmistakably sharp-eyed. She treated women for nervous afflictions using methods that mirrored those documented in Milbridge. When officials investigated, the physician vanished. His practice was sold, his home abandoned. The woman he described disappeared without trace. Only his account, preserved in a colleague's memoir, survived. This disappearance does not prove Agatha's presence, yet it adds to the unsettling pattern. Whenever the Ashfords surface, records blur, witnesses vanish, and silence resumes. The weight of the cabinet. The discovery of the Providence cabinet in 1861, filled with skull fragments and labels in Prudence Ashford's hand, demonstrates that silence was not merely cultural. It was authorities removed the cabinet from the asylum basement and sealed it in government storage. No charges were filed, no names were published. This act of burial was not neutral. It was a choice to prioritize stability over truth. By sealing the evidence, officials ensured that the public never learned how deeply the Ashford network reached. Silence as legacy. By the end of the 19th century, the Ashfords were rarely named, but their presence lingered. They existed in the margins of textbooks, in the silence of families, in the ruins of Milbridge. Their legacy was not only the knowledge they extracted through cruelty, but the silence that allowed that knowledge to flourish. To study the Ashfords is to confront the uneasy truth that atrocity and progress often share a thin boundary, and that societies frequently choose to forget the atrocity in order to keep the progress. A survivor's burden. Amid all this silence, one voice did speak. Sarah Whitman. Her testimony remained the most vivid account of life in the convent, yet her courage cost her everything. Shunned by her community, estranged from her family, she lived the rest of her life under an assumed name in California. Her memoir, published only posthumously in 1863, confirmed details that matched the hidden archives, but by then, the medical world had moved on. Sarah's words became a curiosity, a relic of hysteria literature, rather than the indictment she intended. The silence swallowed even the true horror. In the end, the most chilling element of the Ashford story is not the sisters' cruelty, nor their escape, nor even their possible survival. It is the complicity of silence, families protecting reputations, doctors protecting careers, governments protecting institutions. The Ashfords could only operate for 2 decades because society preferred not to look. They could only continue, even in exile, because society chose progress over accountability. Silence, not just cruelty, was their greatest weapon. As Part 8 closes, the tale of the Ashfords reveals less about 3 women than about the society that enabled them. The sisters may have been brilliant, monstrous, and relentless, but they thrived because silence was easier than confrontation. Their story forces us to ask, how many advances in our own age rest upon unspoken suffering? How many silences persist, waiting to be uncovered? The Ashfords may be gone, their convent reduced to ashes, but their lesson remains. Atrocities do not vanish when forgotten. They linger whispering beneath the fabric of progress, reminding us that silence is never neutral. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Ashford name had become a faded rumor. For the families who once whispered of missing daughters, silence had ossified into habit. Their descendants had no interest in reopening wounds, yet in the vaults of government buildings, a different kind of preservation endured. Behind locked iron doors, stacked in crates marked only with numbers, the records of the Ashford convent remained sealed, and silence, like pressure, does not last forever. The sealed boxes. In 1902, clerks in the Department of Public Health discovered mislabeled crates while reorganizing storage in Washington. Inside were bundles of papers, depositions, surgical diagrams, correspondence between federal agents, and testimonies from survivors. At first they were dismissed as irrelevant, a relic of frontier medicine, but when a junior clerk noted the repeated phrase, "Convent of Eternal Tears, Millbridge, Maine," the documents were quietly transferred to the Library of Congress under restricted classification. For decades they lay dormant, accessible only to senior officials. The crates carried not only words but objects: jars with tissue preserved in cloudy fluid, crude surgical instruments engraved with initials AB, and folded sketches of human skulls with regions marked for incision. Each fragment testified to a systematized cruelty that contradicted the public record of mere regular treatment. The historian's curiosity. It was not until 1937 that a scholar, Lionel Markham of Harvard, stumbled across references to these restricted boxes. Markham was researching the history of psychosurgery and had grown skeptical of its official origin stories. His inquiries led him to correspondence between 19th century physicians and unnamed ladies in Maine. Markham requested access to the restricted files. His appeal was denied, but his persistence attracted attention. A sympathetic librarian allowed him a brief glance at the catalog entry. That glimpse was enough. Markham spent the next decade tracing the shadows of the Ashfords across footnotes, marginalia, and private collections. His 1949 article, "Hidden Mothers of American Psychosurgery," was published in a minor historical journal. Though written cautiously, it revived whispers that the Ashfords had not been merely healers, nor merely criminals, but foundational contributors to modern medicine. The article was swiftly denounced, then ignored, yet it marked the beginning of the archive's awakening. The war and its echoes. World War II altered the context. As the world learned of the atrocities performed in German and Japanese laboratories, Americans were forced to confront the uncomfortable proximity between medical progress and moral collapse. In this atmosphere, Markham's claims were reconsidered,
Comparisons were inevitable. The Ashford's dissections of the brain to map function paralleled the neurological experiments uncovered in Europe. The conditioning regimens temperance devised bore resemblance to techniques now called behavioral modification. Scholars began to suspect that the line between science and atrocity had been blurred long before the 20th century. A congressional inquiry in 1948 briefly considered unsealing the Ashford files, but political leaders feared scandal. The files were not released. Instead, they were moved to deeper storage, with access permitted only to vetted researchers. The silence held, but the pressure grew stronger. Folklore into fact. Meanwhile, folklore refused to die. In Millbridge, stories of the Black Sisters persisted through generations. Children dared one another to approach the burned convent grounds. Travelers reported seeing strange figures in the wood. When anthropologists in the 1960s collected these tales, they noted how consistently the details matched archival fragments. The mention of surgical scars, the smell of ether, the promise of healing. The boundary between oral tradition and hidden documentation began to dissolve. The Ashfords were no longer simply ghosts or criminals. They became liminal, suspended between history and myth, fact and nightmare. The gradual leak, the true turning point, came in 1972, when a Freedom of Information request compelled the release of partial record. Families descended from victims, long silent, had demanded clarity. The files revealed numbers. Over 600 women processed, hundreds mutilated, dozens preserved. The shock was profound. Newspapers reported it briefly, though often with sensationalist tone. Universities scrambled to downplay the connection between Ashford methods and current medical practice. The American Psychological Association issued statements condemning past atrocities, while distancing contemporary science from the convent. Yet the documents were incomplete. Critical volumes remained sealed, particularly those containing correspondence with prominent physicians. The government's hesitation hinted at an even deeper entanglement, that the Ashfords were not outsiders, but woven into the very structure of professional medicine.
The survivor's voice restored. In the midst of this revelation, Sarah Whitman's memoir resurfaced. A single surviving copy, long dismissed as eccentric rambling, was republished in 1975 with scholarly annotations. Readers were struck by her clear, restrained descriptions. The sound of metal trays, the odor of chloroform, the blank stares of girls after treatments. Her words, once buried in obscurity, now resonated as historical testimony. For the first time, the Ashford's victims had a voice beyond rumor, the modern reckoning. By the 1980s, historians of medicine openly debated the Ashford case. Some argued that their research, though monstrous, advanced understanding of brain function by decades. Others insisted that no knowledge could justify such cruelty. The debate mirrored the larger reckoning with 20th century atrocities. What disturbed scholars most was not the sisters' brutality, but the complicity surrounding them. The doctors who referred patients, the families who kept silent, the officials who sealed files. The Ashford case was not just about 3 women. It was about an entire culture, willing to look away. The shadow today. Even now, whispers persist. Some claim that sealed files remain in government vaults, containing the full surgical diagrams and correspondence with elite universities. Others believe the sisters' methods were quietly integrated into psychiatric practice, under new names. What is undeniable is this: the Ashfords were not forgotten. They survive in medical textbooks, in whispered family shame, in the dark curiosity of internet forums. Their legacy forces a question no archive can silence. How many of our modern cures rest on the bones of the nameless and the silenced? Part 9 reveals the Ashfords not as distant relics, but as recurring shadows in the story of medicine. Their archives, long hidden, refuse to remain closed. Each generation rediscovers them, and each time the same horror resurfaces, that progress and atrocity are often inseparable, and that silence ensures their union. The final chapter looms, for in the 20th century, as secrecy began to fracture, the Ashford story was no longer just history. It became a warning, one that still echoes whenever science demands sacrifices in the name of advancement. By the close of the 20th century, the Ashford story had seeped from sealed archives into public consciousness. What was once whispered in Maine kitchens or dismissed as folklore now stood exposed in academic journals, documentaries, and late-night radio broadcasts. Yet exposure did not bring closure. Instead, the revelation that hundreds of women had been mutilated and murdered under the guise of medicine raised a haunting truth. The Ashfords had not been aberrations, but part of a larger tapestry of exploitation woven into the fabric of progress. Unsealing the final records. In 1994, after sustained pressure from journalists and advocacy groups, the Department of Health reluctantly released additional volumes from the Ashford files. These contained correspondence between the sisters and prominent physicians across the United States and Europe. The letters were chilling in their normality: requests for specimens, updates on reformations, invoices for surgical instruments. Among the correspondence were names later celebrated in medical history. Some of the very doctors whose portraits hung in lecture halls had written with respect, even admiration, to the Ashford. They praised the thoroughness of your case notes and the remarkable consistency of your interventions. The implications were explosive. If the Ashfords were monsters, they were monsters welcomed into the parlor of science. Universities issued defensive statements, distancing themselves from their forebears, but the evidence was undeniable. Modern neurology had roots tangled in the bloodied soil of the Millbridge convent. Families confront the past. For descendants of the victims, the unsealed files brought pain and vindication. For generations, many had lived with whispered family lore: a great-grandmother who went away for treatment, a sister who joined the convent and never came back. Now the euphemisms crumbled. In Millbridge, families gathered in the small community hall to read aloud the names of the women documented in the archives. Some wept openly, others sat in silence, their faces pale with a grief inherited but never spoken. For them, the Ashford revelations were not academic. They were personal histories denied for over a century. One woman, a school teacher named Helen Douglas, stood before the assembly holding a faded portrait of her ancestor Rebecca. For years we were told she became a nun, but she didn't. She was taken from us, and they made sure we never said her name. The room fell silent, the weight of decades collapsing into that moment. Academia's reckoning. The academic community struggled with its complicity. Historians of medicine debated whether the Ashfords' work should be acknowledged as a foundation of neurology or erased as criminal aberration. Some insisted their meticulous notes had advanced knowledge of brain function by decades. Others argued that citing their research perpetuated injustice. Yet the truth remained uncomfortable. Techniques resembling lobotomy, psychosurgery, and behavioral conditioning all echoed the Ashfords' methods. The sisters' careful dissections and behavioral protocols had been too precise, too detailed to ignore. Their shadows lingered in textbooks under different names. A 1998 symposium at Johns Hopkins, titled Ethics and Origins: The Ashford Legacy, drew heated debate. Survivors' descendants protested outside holding signs reading "Knowledge built on courses" and "Remember the Forgotten Women." Inside, physicians and ethicists wrestled with the question: can science born of atrocity ever be redeemed? The conspiracy of silence examined. More disturbing than the Ashfords' acts was the silence that had followed. Families who feared scandal, officials who sealed records, academics who cited findings without asking questions, all had ensured the crimes remained hidden for nearly 2 centuries. This silence became the subject of documentaries in the The Forgotten Convent, 2004, drew parallels between the Ashford cover-up and modern whistleblower cases, asking whether institutions had truly learned to value truth over reputation. Viewers were unsettled not only by the brutality of the sisters, but by the realization that entire systems had chosen ignorance as safety. Echoes in the present. As the 21st century progressed, the Ashfords re-emerged not just as history, but as metaphor. Scholars cited them in debates over bioethics, cloning, artificial intelligence, and pharmaceutical trials. Each controversy seemed to mirror the same dilemma: how much suffering can be justified in the pursuit of progress? Conspiracy theorists took the story further. Online forums buzzed with claims that the sisters had survived into old age and passed their methods to secret societies. Others insisted that modern psychiatric facilities continued their experiments under different names. While most of these claims were unsubstantiated, they reflected a deeper unease. the sense that the Ashford spirit of ambition unbound by morality remained alive. The ghost of Sarah Whitman. In 2008, a previously unknown cache of letters by Sarah Whitman, the sole survivor who escaped the convent, surfaced in a California estate sale, addressed to a cousin. The letters revealed the depth of her isolation. "I speak of them," she wrote in 1842, "and people smile as if I tell fairy tales, but the scars on my scalp are real. The screams I still hear at night were not imagined. They erased those women, and in erasing them, they erased me too." Her words gave renewed urgency to the demand for recognition. Activists argued that Whitman, once dismissed as hysterical, should be remembered as a whistleblower whose courage forced the truth into daylight. A memorial plaque was erected in Millbridge in 2010, bearing her name and the words, "She spoke when silence was easier." The site of the convent. Today, the grounds where the convent of Eternal Tears once stood are a tangle of weeds and broken stone. Local teenagers still dare each other to wander the ruins, claiming to hear whispers or see pale figures in the tree line. Archaeologists who surveyed the site in 2012 uncovered fragments of surgical instruments and burned journals, further confirming the accounts preserved in archive. The townspeople remain divided. Some want the land left untouched, fearing that excavation only reopens wounds. Others advocate for a permanent memorial, insisting that erasure is the final victory of the Ashfords' cruelty. The debate mirrors the larger struggle: how to live with a history that resists forgetting, a caution that endures. In the end, the Ashford saga refuses to resolve neatly. It is not simply a tale of villains punished, for the sisters were never, nor is it a narrative of justice achieved, for most victims remain nameless, their stories silenced by time. Instead, it is a mirror held up to society, reflecting the dangers of unchecked ambition, the fragility of ethical boundaries, and the price of silence. Every age finds its own Ashford. Sometimes they wear lab coats, sometimes suits, sometimes robes. They promise progress, healing, or salvation, and behind closed doors they demand sacrifices. The Ashfords' legacy is not confined to the 19th century. It lingers in every debate where human dignity collides with the hunger for discovery. It whispers in every sealed archive and every institution that prefers silence to scandal. Perhaps that is the true horror, not the surgeries performed in a main convent, but the knowledge that such horrors can and will be repeated whenever ambition outweighs compassion, and whenever society chooses not to look too close. The shadows of the Ashford sisters stretch long across history. They remind us that progress without conscience is a ruinous path, and that the cost of silence is always measured in life. And though their convent was reduced to ash, their story remains macabre, unfinished and waiting in the archives for the next generation to rediscover.